some of the enormous challenges facing our economy, Washington's failure to address those challenges, and a way forward. Today, there are nearly 23 million Americans who are looking for full-time jobs, 23 million. This includes people among those 9% of Americans who are on the unemployment rolls, but it also has to include a lot of Americans who have given up looking for work or who are scraping by with part-time jobs when they really want a full-time job. What makes this even more troubling to me is that among the Americans who are being counted, that 9%, the average length of time on the unemployment rolls is now nearly 10 months. That's the longest ever recorded. These folks are looking for help. They're looking to us for leadership, and they're looking for us to help get the economy back on track by creating a better environment for job creation, economic growth. At the same time, as we've just heard from the previous two speakers, the federal government faces serious, unprecedented budgetary challenges. Washington is now borrowing nearly 40 cents of every dollar it spends. It looks like we'll have another record deficit this year, and we'll have the highest debt ever. Government spending has gone from about $25,000 per household to more than $31,000 per household just in the last 4 years. And the national debt is doubling over the 2008 levels, doubling since 2008. We've hit this $14.3 trillion debt limit, and if we do nothing about it, we're going to end up with an economic crisis, much like Greece is facing today. I just listened to the comments from my colleague from New York and my friend from Alaska, and they're talking about the fact that interest rates might go up unless we vote to extend the debt limit. Well, I am talking to a lot of economists and thinking about the impact it'll have in Ohio. If we don't do something about the deficit and debt, when we extend the debt limit again, interest rates will go up. The value of the dollar will continue to go down. Inflation will go up. The point is not that we want to go into default. I hope nobody does in this chamber. And despite what my friend from New York said, colleague from New York, there is no Republican interest in defaulting on the debt. No one wants to default on the debt. But it's just like when you have a credit card in your family. Once you max out on the credit card and you try to get a higher line of credit, you ought to look at your underlying problem. Because if you don't, you're going to get right back into the financial problems you're in. That's what Republicans are saying is, if we do not deal with the underlying problem, which is this huge fiscal imbalance we just talked about, $14.3 trillion debt that's doubled since 2008, then we are going to find ourselves in a financial and economic problem that will result in a spike in interest rates, will result in this negative impact on all Americans, car loans, mortgages, student loans. So this is why it's so critical over the next few weeks as we work through this that we deal with not just extending the debt limit. I guess that's a pretty easy thing to do. Just say, let's go borrow more. We're already borrowing about 40 cents of every dollar. But we have to deal with the underlying problem. So what are we doing here in the Senate to deal with that underlying problem? Very little. This week, we're debating a meaningless sense of the Senate resolution. This is what's called a non-binding resolution. It won't create a single job. It won't reform a single part of our tax code. It won't save $1 of government spending. It does nothing to address the debt limit. It's a distraction, and that's why earlier today I voted against proceeding to it. Serious times demand serious work. I was pleased when the Senate came together to cancel this week's scheduled recess because we should be here. We pledged to return to Washington and to confront these economic challenges we talked about and the budget problems we face. And I supported doing that, but this has not been a serious effort. By the way, the Senate has not even passed the basic budget for this year. There is no budget, which is highly unusual. It also never passed a budget last year. So instead of talking about non-binding resolutions, we should be talking about a budget. We should have a budget on the floor. We should be debating it. The other side will have issues. We'll have issues to talk about. None of us necessarily agree with one another on the precise provisions of a budget. That's fine. Let's have the debate and end up with a blueprint for our spending going forward. President Obama talks about getting involved and showing true leadership, but to be honest, he hasn't stepped up to the plate. The best example would be his own budget. He's required by law to submit one every year. He did submit a budget. That budget was voted on the floor of the Senate because we don't have our own budget. We voted on his budget. It was unanimously rejected, 96-0. Partly because, as Democrats will say, a few weeks after he submitted the budget, he gave a speech where he said, well, you know, my budget really wasn't adequate to the task. And so he rejected his own budget, in a sense. But he offered no alternatives, no specifics. His own budget, by the way, was so unserious that it doubled the debt over the next decade. And that's why, again, it was voted down by this Senate. But what is our budget? What do we believe in? We should have that debate. We need to know what the numbers are, what the president has for a vision over the next 10 years. That's what the budget is supposed to do. And of course, we need to know what he will do to help grow the economy. In my view, getting the budget under control is a matter of restraining spending, but it's also a matter of growing the economy. If we don't grow the economy, and that will increase revenues by growing the economy, we won't be able to get out of this deep fiscal hole that we're in, with record deficits, a record debt, and again, an increasing negative impact on our economy. The lack of a true debate on this is not from a lack of ideas, by the way. Senate Republicans have developed a common sense jobs plan, much of which I think should be and can be bipartisan. It includes just a lot of common sense ideas. One is to reform the tax code. Senator Begich from Alaska talked about that earlier. That's to make sure that our tax code works better for our economy, that it's simpler, that it encourages investment and job creation. Economists across the board would agree that our current code is inefficient. We should do that as a body. That will help develop the economy and jobs and economic activity, which will increase revenue. We need to rein in regulations. As I'm home talking to small businesses, the first thing they talk to me about is the latest federal regulation. A new one out today from the Environmental Protection Agency, which is impacting my home state of Ohio, is going to result in loss of jobs at a time when we need jobs desperately. There are very specific proposals here. Maybe these aren't proposals everyone can agree to. What are your proposals? Let's debate this issue. Let's pass legislation that forces a cost-benefit analysis of regulations. Let's be sure that the regulators are using the least burdensome and least costly alternative. These are common sense ideas. Creating a more competitive workforce, make sure that our workforce is competitive for the 21st century, incredibly important. Expanding exports to create more jobs. Energy, being sure that we have the ability to get away from our dangerous dependence on foreign oil by creating more resources right here in this country. These are all common sense proposals that we should work on because they relate to the very issue we should be talking about this week, which is how to deal with our budget imbalance. The proposal, by the way, also does cap government spending. It does say that we need to have a balance between revenues and expenditures, which is only common sense, because until we get the fiscal house in order, it's going to be very difficult to get our economy moving. It's like a wet blanket over the economy, creating uncertainty, unpredictability. On the budget, let's be clear. The long-term problem is from soaring spending, not falling revenues. This is from the Congressional Budget Office. It's a nonpartisan group. Their job is to give us the data, to tell us what's going to happen with spending and with revenues. This is what they tell us. Even if we keep current tax rates for everybody, in other words, don't get rid of the so-called Bush tax cuts, revenues are still expected to rebound above the historical average of 18% of the economy. If, in fact, the Bush tax cuts do not get extended, which is current law, right now they're expected to end at the end of next year, those tax revenues will be well above the historic average. Instead of 18%, they get up in the next several years to about 20%. Over the last 50 years, it's been about 18%. The deficit is rising not because of lack of revenue, but because spending is now at 24.5% to 25% of our economy, as compared to its historical level over the last 50 years of about 20 or 20.5% of the economy. What's going to happen? Well, CBO has it right there. It's projected to rise on the spending side to 26% of the economy over the next several years, then 30, then 40, then 50% of the economy on spending alone. We talked earlier about the fact that we've gone from $25,000 per household government spending to $31,000 per household in the last 4 years alone. That spending continues to grow, and if we don't deal with that spending, we'll never be able to get the budget in balance. That's the top issue, and again, we have to face this before we extend the debt limit again. If we don't, there will be major economic problems. Look at what Standard & Poor's and Moody's and Fitch, these are the so-called credit agencies, what they're telling us. They're saying, yes, default would be a terrible thing, let's not default. But they're also saying, but if you don't deal with the fiscal imbalance, if you don't deal with the record deficits and debts, there will be major and negative impacts on the economy, and they will be in a position where they will feel they need to downgrade our debt, which means higher interest rates. Having tax rates chase this spending is not the solution. It won't balance the budget. Moreover, it will not spur this sputtering economy to grow and to create the jobs that we've talked about today. It won't work to get us back to work. In fact, virtually all economic theories agree that tax increases harm economic growth. When you tax something, people do less of it. That's why we tax smoking. So if you want economic growth, the last thing we should do is to raise taxes on working, raise taxes on savings, raise taxes on investment. These are not the way to get the economy moving again. Instead, we should be unleashing American entrepreneurs, not putting more taxes on them. Some suggest we must choose between creating jobs and reining in government. My view is the opposite is true. Reining in government can help create jobs. The less the government spends, the more money remains in the private sector for families and entrepreneurs to spend. The less the government borrows, the more savings are available for businesses to borrow in order to expand, as well as for families to borrow for a new home, again, a new car or a student loan. Think about it. The government borrowing all this money is almost like a big sponge, taking so much of the savings. Today, we are borrowing, again, more than 40 cents of every dollar the government spends. That's having a negative impact on the economy. Reducing the deficit also reduces the risk of a debt-induced financial crisis that might otherwise dwarf what we've seen happening in Greece today. But don't take my word for it. Lots of economists have looked at this. There's a great study out there that I encourage people to look at. It's done by the economists Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhart. And Rogoff and Reinhart do something very simple. They go all around the world and look at different economies and determine what happens when debt gets too big as compared to the size of the economy. And their view is that when the debt gets to 90% of the size of an economy of a country, it has a substantial negative impact on the economic growth and jobs in that country. Their data suggests that when it gets to 90% of the economy, there's a 1% reduction in the economic growth. So instead of in the first quarter, our U.S. economy growing at 1.8%, if we didn't have 90% of debt to our economy, it should have grown at 2.8%. And what does that mean? That 1% growth that we would otherwise have means 1 million jobs. So if we didn't have this huge debt, and right now it's at about 93 or 95% of our economy, it'll be at 100% of the economy this year, then we would have more jobs. If you look at what Rogoff and Reinhart has said, it means we'd have about 1 million more jobs in this country. Could we use those jobs? Yes. We need them desperately. So there is a connection between this overspending and this huge gap we've got between revenues and spending and our economy and our ability to get this economy back on track. Over 25 years, by the way, if we continued the way we're going, it would leave the economy nearly 1/4 smaller than it would otherwise be. Think about that, a 25% reduction in our economy. In order to create jobs and growth, we've got to balance the budget, and we've got to reduce that debt that is now over 90%. There are two ways to reduce the debt share of the economy. One is to make the debt smaller, and the other is to make the economy larger. We know that raising taxes will shrink the economy. Instead, we've got to keep tax rates low to create jobs and expand the economy. And we have to reform the tax code so that it works better. And again, economists across the spectrum will tell you we can have a better economy if we have a more sensible tax code. We must also responsibly reduce government spending, of course, to rein in the debt. Low tax rates and spending restraint will bring prosperity, alleviate this moral avalanche of debt that we're otherwise leaving on the laps of our children and grandchildren. I understand that some of my colleagues have their own approaches to this, to jobs, to the economy, to the budget deficits. That's fine. Let's have the debate. There are numerous proposals in Congress to reduce the spending, balance the budget, reform entitlements. Instead of voting on political, non-binding resolutions, as we've done this week in the United States Senate, let's have that debate. We have too many important issues. Let's stop fiddling while Rome burns. Mr. President, I yield the floor.